Gospel Light, a book by George Lamsa. A word about the author. George Lamsa, a native Assyrian, was born and reared in that part of the ancient biblical land from which Abraham migrated to Palestine. His people, because they were isolated for many centuries, preserved the Aramaic language and the ancient biblical customs which have disappeared everywhere else. Well, the actual language preserved the original manuscripts, i.e. the Old Testament Tab Asher Aramaic and perhaps the Galilean Aramaic New Testament manuscripts. His people, George Lamsa's people, because they were isolated for many centuries, preserved the Aramaic language and the ancient biblical customs which have disappeared everywhere else. The language and the manners and the customs of his people are almost identical with that in which Jesus said his contemporaries were reared. The language and the manners and the customs of his people are almost identical with that in which Jesus and his contemporaries were reared. His family, from the days of the patriarchs to 1918, lived a simple pastoral life. Even today they speak in idioms and parables, some of which it would be difficult for a Westerner to understand. Yet different mindset. In some, basically they'll say something like Jesus would say, I and the Father are one, and a person with a Western mindset or Christian would think, that proves that Jesus is God. No, it doesn't. It's talking about, through that Eastern mindset, that they are one in unity, co-equal, of the triune Godhead, three persons in essence. The author began his study of the scriptures in the Aramaic under the teachers of his tribe. Then he was educated in the Archbishop of Canterbury's College in Persia and Turkey, and after the First World War in the Virginia Theological Seminary of Alexandria, Virginia, USA. In addition to being a translator, Mr. Lamsa was a world traveller and lecturer, because it's long past. His translations from the Aramaic and comments on the scriptures have aroused tremendous interest both in America and in Europe. They have helped many to a better understanding of the greatest of all books, i.e. the Bible, the scriptures. Here is a facsimile of one of the few surviving Aramaic texts of the New Testament, with exception of the book of Revelation and a few epistles. It was found in the ruins of an ancient Assyrian church in Persian Kurdistan. Since the publication of Lamsa's translations of the four Gospels from Aramaic, these manuscripts have increased greatly in value. And this one is showing portions of ancient Aramaic, i.e. the Syriac, New Testament manuscripts recently placed at around early 6th century AD. So it could possibly be a copy of an original copy, possibly. Showing portion or page of newly discovered Aramaic or Syriac New Testament manuscripts, now in possession of, or at that time, in possession of, or possessage of M.Lamsa. And showing portion of Psalm 7 from Codex Ambrosianus. And there's a note here by somebody, Gospel Light, presented to the library by Miss Helen Buck Wagner, Santa Ria Ranch, Vernon, Texas. We're pretty sure that's what it says. It looks like Wagner. Other books in print by the same author, and there's comments by the New York Times and the Christian Herald. Gospel Light, comments on the teachings of Jesus from Aramaic and Unchanged Eastern Customs by George M.Lamsa, B.A. Ethnologist, Aramaic language expert. He dedicates it to a certain person. Was dedicated to a certain person. Contents. Forward. This volume is the result of many questions asked by men and women who have attended his lectures on Aramaic. Letters of inquiry had also come from ministers and laymen of many Christian denominations and other faiths who had read his translations of the four Gospels from Aramaic and other books on the subject. Many of these people expressed the desire to have in writing his interpretation of the passages which he had explained in his lectures, and to have explained also other obscure and important passages in the Gospel narratives. From his knowledge of the Aramaic language and ancient Semitic customs. These constitute the background of the Old and New Testament and the teachings of Jesus. Many lovers of the Bible who value truth more than pride and sectarian dogmas are ready to welcome any light thrown on the teaching of our Lord and any suggestion which makes them clearer. In this work, he's discussing difficult and important passages and not touching on those which are clear and simple. He was neither trying to discuss theological questions nor attempting to describe distances, localities and dates. This had already been done by others who have made a thorough study of these subjects. In his introduction of the four Gospels, he did not try to quote other authorities on that subject. The reason for this was not that he was unaware of the enormous material written on the subject, but because what he said concerning the Aramaic language and the Eastern version of the Gospels was based on the history of the oldest Christian church. These historic facts are the testimonies and writings of the Eastern Fathers and other writers from the earliest centuries to the present day. What is a fact needs no defense. Eastern and Western scholars agree Aramaic was the language of our Lord, or Jesus the Messiah, Jesus the Christ, and his disciples. Galilean Aramaic was. And he may have been well versed in the Hebrew and the Syriac as well. And the scriptures were written in Aramaic. Furthermore, the antiquity and originality of the Eastern version is always defended by the Eastern Christians of all denominations. So far, not the slightest evidence contrary to this assumption has been discovered, and he prays that God, through this work, would prove helpful to all lovers of the teachings of our beloved Lord and Master, Mamishisho, or Jesus the Messiah. George M.Lamsa. Forward by John Peabody Harrington, D.Sc., must be Doctor of Science, Ethnologist, Smithsonian Institution, Washington. Miracle of miracles to this particular person is the survival of the language of Christ through all the vicissitudes of the centuries, even down to our own time, as a vernacular and literary tongue, and the power of a native read to speak this tongue to interpret the Gospels, the Acts of the Apostles, and the other writings of the New Testament with floods of newer and truer light. It is indeed as if this language were a precious bit of amber which has embedded in it and thus preserved throughout the ages some bit of prehistoric life which otherwise would not be known. Hidden away in the mountains of Kurdistan and Mesopotamia, this tongue, or this particular language, almost exactly in the form spoken by the Master 2,000 years ago. So that's where we say, as 15 Alexander, the Galilean Aramaic translator from Mesopotamia, Syria, says, that the language preserves the scriptures. The scriptures were preserved by that particular language. So it was hidden away in the mountains of Kurdistan and Mesopotamia, almost exactly in the form spoken by the Master 2,000 years ago, and has escaped by a miracle, indeed being trampled underfoot by conquering armies of Greeks, Persians, Romans and Turks, to carry with it and have embedded in it, like the specimen embalmed in ancient amber, the life and thought and customs unaltered of people who lived in the time of Christ and in that period before his life, which laid the foundation for the Jewish and Christian faiths. Lamsa claims that customs, manners and languages in his country have not changed since the time of Jesus, are strongly supported by recent facts brought to light in Ethiopia. So they're all backing it up. There's people in Ethiopia, churches, etc. Ancient tribes with their unchanged customs and languages are just brought before the attention of Western scholars. The unbroken dynastic descent of Emperor Haile Selassie or Selassie I of Ethiopia, may seem unbelievable to Westerners, but it is a fact and unbroken tradition to the people of Ethiopia. This is because of isolation. It is true that our civilization is changing every day, but Ethiopians and Assyrians have been for centuries isolated in their mountain fastnesses, cut off from the rest of the world. Then again, what to us looks old, to them is sacred and valuable. Their very life is based on their ancestry and their ancient customs and traditions, which they tenaciously wish to carry on to future generations. No foreigner to Mr. Lamsa's Assyrian nationality, however learned or studious, even if he spent his life among the mountaineering, could do the present task of interpreting the New Testament to the Western world with quite the fidelity and background that comes from one raised on an Assyrian mother's knee. Speaking both the Christian and the Jewish dialects of modern Assyrian of the region, he knows the language of Christ even as the apostles knew it, and has the feeling for nicety of expression which is lost or which has been overlooked in many of the passages of the Greek translation, which has hitherto been the means of communication between the words and times of Christ and our Western civilization. This has indeed been a task to tax all the knowledge and linguistic knack of this comparatively young Assyrian who has consecrated his life to this service for mankind. It will be noted in the following pages that Mr. Lamsa has touched only on the passages that have not been fully understood. To many of these he has given new life, a brilliant interpretation taken from the standpoint of his own Oriental life, or his Eastern life. Right? Words have survived, every word a bundle of meanings which combine with the meanings of other words to form a fabric as delicate as that of an Oriental rug, and as impossible for Western factory-made learning or machinery to imitate. The survival of the personal mechanism to feel for and interpret is in itself as great a miracle as that of the survival of the language. It has been a popular fallacy that the so-called modern dialects of Assyrian, which is but another name of Aramaic, have become bastardized, and that is impossible for any language to maintain itself without the most fundamental changes during a period of 2,000 years. Let whoever wishes to believe this do so. When we actually take the Aramaic words recorded in the New Testament and compare them with the modern Americanized English Bible versions, we are astounded to find them unchanged. In fact, Mr. Lamsa makes an interesting point that any literary language, such as that in which the old Assyrian Gospels are written, is of necessity more or less artificial and flowery, so that the modern language, such as Mr. Lamsa himself talks, is more like the daily speech of Christ and his disciples than like any embellished literary form of the language. The colloquial then and now is the sea, the literary is the surface, agitation and foam. Even to those interested principally in Judaism, Lamsa's writings, as those of a speaker of a pure Semitic language, have a fundamental appeal. The Gospels were written for Semitics, or Semites, right? Lamsa gives us the semantics of Semitics. To all who love the rich spiritual life and theology of the Jewish people, Lamsa will have almost as much claim to approach as to Christians. The mountain Assyrian with his Christian religion is as purely Semitic religion and all as could be his brother of the Jewish or Mohammedan culture and faith, or Islam. Greek came into the story of the New Testament merely because it was a European language spoken nearest to the Semitic territory and the only one which had spilled over liberally into that territory. Jews and Jewish Christians in Alexandria, Egypt, which has since the earliest times had large Semitic and Greek populations, yet Hellenistic Jews, etc., realizing that they were fast giving up their Aramaic tongue, translating their Biblia, or scriptures with little preparation into the Greek language, as the Septuagint. Saint Jerome in the 4th century wrote the Vulgate. Further European translations were based on Greek and Latin, with some scholarly recourse to Hebrew. Aramaic in its modern form was used not at all. The miracle of its discovery and utilization as a new key to the understanding of the scriptures will constantly impress the reader of Mr. Lamsa's fact-filled pages. John P. Harrington. Introduction. These old books, they have these 4 words and another 4 word and long introduction. Sometimes they're about 20 pages long. Introduction. Attempts have been made to portray the life and teaching of Jesus throughout the centuries. He is set forth in a variety of ways by people of different countries, as though he belonged to them. Europeans depict him with light hair and blue eyes. Abyssinians portray him as having curly hair, a dark face, and clad in nomadic attire. To the Hindus, he is a learned mystic with an ascetic face and pictured meditating in the shadows of the temples. To Russians, he appears like themselves. Semitic peoples claim Jesus truly because he was born and reared among them. Their customs and manners play an important part in his life and teaching. They therefore know and understand him far better than others. While prohibited by the scriptures to make pictures of any sort, say we're not allowed to do that, right? Make images of him, etc. According to scripture. By the scriptures to make picture of any sort, they visualize him with the mental eye. So it's mind's eye, right? In the imagination. One of the most amazing facts about Jesus is regardless of his race and colour, he appeals to peoples of all nationalities. His divine personality and his living teaching rise above all barriers and reveal him as he actually was, a man without a country but claimed by people of every country throughout the world. All racial characteristics retire into the background in the unique drama of his life. Limitations or prejudices do not interfere with his universal message. Although he was born in a poor home and brought up in a small village town, Jesus appeals alike to the rich and the poor, to the conqueror and the conquered. Nothing has been able to overshadow his influence in all the centuries. There is an aspect in the life and teaching of Jesus which could best be depicted by the descendants of his own race from the particular standpoint of their own Oriental life and with due regard to the background of traditions. It is this phase of his teachings and sayings which the author was attempting to illustrate in this commentary. And what he wrote is based upon customs and practices which have remained undisturbed from early biblical times up to the eve of the World War I, etc. Strange to say, a fragment of that ancient Semitic civilization had survived without change in Mesopotamia and Kurdistan until recent days. When you wrote this book, right? These descendants of the once mighty Assyrians and of the 10 tribes, a small and feeble remnant, were found in seclusion in the fastnesses of the rugged mountainous country north of Iraq. Well, in the ancient days it was called Iraq. Perhaps also Uruk, maybe. Since the fall of Nineveh, 16 BC, empires have risen and fallen, new nations have been born and old nations have perished. Invading armies of Greeks, Persians, Arabs, Mongols, Turks have fought their battles for supremacy upon the plains of Arbela, Mesopotamia. But these Assyrian descendants were not disturbed by the sound of the triumphant trumpets of the Greek victors in the plains of Arbela, nor were they aware of the Persian defeat by the nomad Arab forces at the Battle of Qadisiyah, 637 AD, and the fall of the Persian Empire before the Muslims, or Mohammedans, after the historic Battle of Nehaband, 642 AD. The wave of conquest continued to flow, but nothing seemed to interfere with the independence of the Assyrian tribes. None of the conquerors attempted to invade the seclusion of this warrior people, nor were the Assyrians aware of the changes constantly taking place on the Mesopotamian plains south of the mountain fortresses. It is interesting to know that until about 15 years ago, prior to this book being printed and published, the Assyrians called the Turks Romaiye, which means the Romans. They thought these belonged to the Christian Roman Empire because the Turks invaded Asia Minor by way of Europe and not by way of Mesopotamia. The survival of these ancient Assyrians, their language and customs, is nothing short of a miracle of divine providence. Semitic culture and languages have elsewhere either been radically altered or replaced by those of the conquering forces. Even the Jews, in spite of their racial tenacity, were unable to withstand the unavoidable changes. They lost their language and customs. The teaching once written by simple men for uncultured people became a mystery and had to be reinterpreted with the aid of commentaries. This conclusion is sustained by Dr. W.A. Wigram, a noted English scholar who spent over 10 years as a missionary and research worker in Kurdistan. He wrote, "A strange survival in an isolated corner of the world, these last representatives of the ancient Assyrian stock have hitherto kept up the most primitive of Semitic customs to an extent that can hardly be paralleled elsewhere. Even in Mesopotamia, marsh districts. As an ancient and fossilized church, they had also preserved ecclesiastical titles and rites and ceremonies which have either perished altogether elsewhere or else have survived only in almost unrecognizable form. Here are a people who, in the time of the beginning of the Christian era, are found living by the lands or in the lands where in the year 600 BC the Assyrian stock had been established since history began. Nor is there any record of any considerable immigration into or immigration from that land in the interval. Their own traditions affirm that they are of the old Assyrian blood, with a possible intermixture of certain Babylonian or Chaldean elements. It was only natural that this old Semitic stock, living where nothing had ever occurred to disturb their habits of life, should keep up the old Semitic customs. They still lived, or did live, till the changes of the Great War, World War I, etc., brought about an alteration. The life of the Old Testament Bible customs, or those that we call such, were of course not peculiar to the Hebrew, but were the common heritage of all the stock to which he belonged. This is also true of the language. Aramaic is still spoken by the Assyrians in Kurdistan and parts of Mesopotamia. It was the language spoken by Jesus and his disciples in Galilee. They spoke Galilean Aramaic. It became the vernacular of northern Palestine long before the Babylonian captivity. This was due to the exchange of population. In 722 BC, the 10 tribes were carried captive to Assyria, and their country was repopulated by Assyrians brought from Edessa, or in the Arabic, no, actually that's Urhai. Okay, so you won't go there. Okay, so they were carried captive to Assyria, and their country was repopulated by Assyrians brought from Edessa and other sections beyond the Euphrates. Hebrew was completely lost as a language. The Jews in northern Mesopotamia, Kurdistan and Persia still speak and pray in a dialect of Aramaic known as Lishan Galoth. This, the language, and it's got a note at the bottom here. W.A. Wigram, the Assyrians and their neighbours, paragraph 177, 178, 185, published by G. Bell and Sons, London. So the language of captivity, the dialect spoken in Persia, is related to the Chaldean or Southern Aramaic. Has a note here at the bottom. The towns where Jews speak Aramaic are in northern Mesopotamia. Make this large so I can see it. Sindur, Amedia, Bawar, Zahor, Botan, in Kurdistan, Bashkala and Diza in Persia, Uremia and other towns in the province of Azerbaijan. In other parts, Aramaic has been replaced by Arabic and other languages. W. Batcher on Aramaic language among the Jews by special permission from the Jewish Encyclopedia, Volume 2, copyright by Funk and Wagnalls Company, New York and London. Yeah, they have really good dictionaries, etc. Palestine was a small country and its inhabitants were chiefly herdsmen. Their vocabulary was limited to their local needs, and goes on about that. It is thus clear that the Assyrians have preserved what might be called the background of the biblical culture which existed before Nineveh was built and Abraham had migrated to Palestine. They are the direct descendants of the people who laid the foundations of the great civilization which made religion and history. In that part of the ancient world, some of the people still lead nomadic lives. The tent made of the hair of goats continues to be the home of the roaming tribes. Houses are built in the same style as they were in the days of Hammurabi. Sheepskins persist as containers, hold wine, etc., etc. Oxen with their mouths muzzled so as not to eat any of the scarce wheat are still used for threshing. The earthen oven dug in the house and heated with the grass gathered from the fields by women has been continuously used. Sheep and goats are separated as in ancient days. The old-fashioned earthen lamp is lighted with butter, not oil, now as then. Wheat is ground by the hand grinder operated by two women. The asses, or the donkey's millstone, is yet used to extract oil and so forth. Christianity clearly cannot be understood without a thorough knowledge of Judaism and its Semitic background. These two religions did not develop along parallel lines from two distinctive sources of thought, but one is derived from the other. Judaism represents the old order and Christianity the new. In other words, one is the fulfillment of the other. The origin of most of the problems in our Gospels can be traced to Jewish customs embodied in biblical culture and common to all Semitic people. It is this Semitic atmosphere which connects the Gospels with the Old Testament and the Messianic promises. In those parts of the East where theological books are unknown, religious customs and traditions are followed in daily life by the same conduct from one generation to another without the aid of writings. Owing to European conquest during the Crusades, the establishment of the Latin kingdom in Syria, and the close commercial relations between the peoples of Syria, Palestine and Europe, Western culture penetrated into the Holy Land. Although the ancient order, except in a few isolated regions and small country towns, has almost wholly disappeared from Palestine, or completely, from Palestine and Syria, it still remains undiluted among the ancestors of the Hebrews, Assyrians, in Mesopotamia and Kurdistan. The Gospels are not difficult to understand, and religion is not so complicated as some people suppose. They belong to the simplest and most direct literature ever penned by man. Most people have been taught to think of religion as something mysterious, otherwise it could not be religion. This view was common in early times because of the scarcity of the books. The owner of a book became the sole authority in interpreting the contents. This situation was later changed with the multiplicity of books, or there being many books. This situation was later changed with the multiplicity of books. Today Bibles are given away free. People have broken away from established traditions. They think for themselves and are satisfied only with facts. The problem in understanding the Gospels is largely due to the rapid changes of customs and manners in Europe and America. Added to this is the difficulty caused by translations from a translation. The Greek translation of the Gospels does not adequately express Semitic thought, because they've got the Western mindset, not the Eastern mindset. They don't understand it. So it's foreign to the mind of the Westerner. The Eastern is foreign to the mind of the Westerner, that Western mindset. Christianity was conceived in the minds of Semitic prophets, and scriptures were primarily written for the sole guidance of their own people, just as modern inventions are the product of the Occidental mind and cannot be easily understood by the people of the East without the help of Americans and Europeans. So must an Eastern religion, such as Christianity, is in its origins, have understanding and help from the East. Eastern Christianity preceded that of Greece and Rome by many years. Jesus and his disciples were Galileans, so obviously they spoke Galilean Aramaic, right? The first Christians were Galileans, Jews, Syrians and Assyrians. All these peoples were closely held together by ties of lineage, language and culture. It was natural for Christianity to take root in its own native ground. From there it has spread. Greek culture and literature are undoubtedly the basis of European civilization. Greece has always served also as a clearing house for Semitic ideas and religions, as well as commerce, because Greece is the European country nearest to Asia Minor and Syria. Christianity penetrated into Europe by way of Greece, and Greek became the language of the scriptures in the West. So, because they are of the West, they are a Western nation in that sense. This is true today of the Chinese and Japanese prayer books translated by English and American missionaries from English. The Chinese and Japanese think the English translation is the original, but the English is a translation from Latin and the Latin from Greek. It is true Europe received its culture and religion by way of Greece, but the Greeks imported them from Asia only after their defeat of the Persians and conquest of the East. Previous to this, the Persians carried Oriental culture to Europe during their conquest of parts of Greece. It was the Greek who copied the East and not vice versa. Writing was common, gold and silver were mined, silk and cotton woven, temples built and priesthoods established in Assyria and Babylon, centuries before the Greeks were even known as a people, or they even existed. It is a matter of history. When the Greeks conquered Persia, they were amazed at the wealth and the art of gold and silver craft found in the luxurious palaces. Persia was so far beyond Greece in the culture, Alexander the Great decided to make Babylon his capital, and to further the alliance, he married the daughter of Darius, the Persian king. This is not all. The Greeks borrowed the alphabet from the Orient, from the Easterners, and its characters still retain the original Semitic names and to some extent the original forms, which are derived from Semitic objects. The characters have no meaning in Greek, Latin and other European languages, but they are well understood by those who speak Aramaic. The first alphabet character, Alpha, is an Assyrian word for ox, and the character, it shows it here, A represents the head of an ox. The ox was an Assyrian god, pagan god way back, and the first letter in the Aramaic word for God is Aleph. The second alphabet character, Beta, or Beta in Aramaic, is Bet, which is a shortened form of the word Beta, meaning house. The form of this character is B, shows it here, and resembles the structure of a one-room Assyrian house. The Greeks turned the word upside down and divided it into two because the Greeks had two-story houses. Gamma is the third alphabet character. It is a mispronunciation of the Aramaic word Gamla, which means in this case camel. Maybe in Syriac they have Gamal. The Aramaic character is, it shows it here, which resembles a camel. The Latin letter C from which the English letter is derived is due to the mistake of the Romans, who pronounced Gamla as though it were Kamla. P in Aramaic is, looks like a G there, from Poma, meaning mouth. I Aramaic is derived from Aina, meaning eye, and the character is a sketch of the eye. S Aramaic Simket is derived from Sara, or moon. N is derived from Naga, combination of pick and axe. Evidence of civilization demonstrate that culture, philosophy and religion came from Asia to Europe. Okay, that's of the Easterners at that time. It's not specifically saying China or Japan or any similar to that. It came from Asia to Europe and not brought to Asia from Europe. Even the Armenians, who are recognized as one of the ancient Christian people, used the Aramaic alphabet and language in church services from the 2nd century to 500 AD, when Mesrop invented the present Armenian alphabet. Previous to the 5th century, Armenian Christianity was closely allied to the Assyrian Church, as leaders and writers were largely Assyrians. The Eastern version of the scriptures was used until after the Monophysite controversy, and then for political reasons the Armenian church was allied with the Christian church in the Byzantine Empire. Greek culture, philosophy and religion had no influence on Jesus and his disciples or the early Christians. The Jews resisted every influence not Semitic. So every other foreign, non-Jewish influence, yeah, they avoided it, but not the Semitic. Greek customs and manners were forbidden. During the reigns of Trajan and Hadrian, the Jews were not permitted to learn Greek or use Greek ceremonies. The first part of the Talmud, the Mishnah, emphatically declared it was worse for a Jew to learn Greek than to eat swine flesh or pork. These laws were strictly observed, with few exceptions, by the Palestinian Jews, who jealously preserved their religion, customs and language from contamination from outsiders, etc., their influence. The following is a quotation from Renan, the famous French scholar and archaeologist who spent many years in the East in research work for the imperial government of France. It is not probable that Jesus knew Greek. This language was very little spread in Judea beyond the classes who participated in the government and the towns inhabited by pagans like Caesarea. So there it verifies that he's the Christ, the Son of God, the Messiah, so he can speak any language he wanted to, right? Okay, he had that ability, being him, right? But it's probable that he didn't know Greek, and never spoke it, never wrote it, etc. Neither directly nor indirectly. Then did any element of Greek culture reach Jesus. He knew nothing beyond Judaism. His mind preserved that free innocence which an extended and varied culture always weakens. In the very bosom of Judaism, or the midst of Judaism, he remained a stranger to many efforts, often parallel to his own. Nearly all Jewish literature from the 4th century BC to the 9th century AD was written in Aramaic. Prayers in Aramaic continue to be generally used by Jews in all parts of the world. The liturgies of ancient Christian churches in Syria, Palestine and Mesopotamia are written in the same language, probably Syriac or Galilean Aramaic. The Greek language has never been used for such purposes. There are no traces of Greek customs and culture east of the Euphrates. If Greek influence had been strong in the 1st and 2nd centuries in the East, the word Christos would have been used instead of Mashiach, Messiah, in the Eastern text in the Aramaic word. Sheklehe. Messengers would have been apostolos. This is not the case. The Greeks Hellenized many Aramaic names, but Hebrews, the famous Eastern historian of the 12th century, noted this fact and stated the Greeks changed the forms of many Aramaic nouns and did not pronounce them as given in the originals. For instance, Noha, derived from Aramaic Noha, meaning rest, becomes Noaos, Noah in Greek. Jacob, derived from Aramaic Ikba, meaning heel, becomes Jacobus in Greek. Bar Soma, derived from Aramaic Bar, meaning son, and Soma, meaning fasting, is pronounced Bar Somos. It's in the Greek, possibly. The Aramaic Ishu, derived from the Hebrew Yasha, meaning to save, becomes Jesus, Curia. Okay, so possibly your Yeshua is not coming from the Hebrew, okay, because there's the Hebrew there, Yasha. Okay, so probably your Yeshua is from the Greek, becomes Yesu. Jesus, Jesus becomes. I'll get back here again. Look at that again. The Aramaic Eshu, derived from the Hebrew Yasha, meaning to save, becomes Jesus, or Jesus in the Greek. Right? Curia, or kuria, because that's the N prefix there in Greek. Aramaic for town becomes kurios. Okay, in this case it's not the N prefix of the Greek. That is actually an Aramaic word, kuria. Aramaic for town becomes kurios. Paraklita, derived from Aramaic prak, meaning to save or comfort, becomes parakletos. A few Greek words are found in early Aramaic, but these were in common use, such as strategy, soldiers, estadawata, miles, kostonaries, guards. Some Jews use Greek names, but this does not necessarily mean they spoke Greek. The same practice is carried on today. Compare Lamsa's introduction to the four Gospels for further illustrations, page 16. The Jews in Alexandria spoke Greek because Aramaic was not understood. This explains why Philo, the Jewish philosopher, wrote in Greek. The Old Testament translation, known as the Septuagint, was made into Greek by Jews for Jews who understood neither Aramaic nor Hebrew. This Greek text of the scriptures was not used in Palestine, where it would not have been understood, and where the original texts were in common use. It is not worth mentioning that the Greek Septuagint was not accepted or used by Eastern Christians. This is so today. The Eastern version of the Old Testament is the authorized text of Nestorians, Chaldeans, Roman Catholics, Jacobites, and other Christian groups, and its antiquity and originality are strongly supported by all of them, regardless of their theological differences. The Septuagint was rejected partly because it contained the books of the Apocrypha, which were not included in the Jewish canon. This question was debated at the Jewish Council of Jamnia in 90 AD and settled in favour of the Palestinian decision. It was only after St. Jerome made the Latin Vulgate in the 4th century AD that the Apocrypha was accepted as canonical by the Roman Catholic Church. Had the Gospels been written by Jesus, probably they would have told the story differently, but the Gospels were written by Galileans in their own northern Aramaic dialect for the use of their own people, exceptionally for their people, right? Their Lord was a Galilean who spoke Galilean Aramaic, and inexperienced as these Galileans were, they would not have attempted to record the sacred material in an alien or foreign language like Greek or a pagan language. They did not have access to Bible manuscript and commentaries, but they did the best they could in recording the sayings and works of the Master, which they had heard and learned by heart. The Gospels were written for the followers who had seen and heard Jesus, or Mamishisho, the Messiah, Jesus the Messiah. The simple folk around the Lake of Galilee were the people to whom this new teaching appealed. They were the likely ones to welcome an account written in the language they spoke of the words and works of their beloved Master, and not the Judean enemies, or foreign, or aliens, right? Pagans, who had regarded him as a malefactor and had crucified him. Jerusalem was an international city, and many languages and dialects were spoken there, as was seen in the days of Pentecost. The people of other nationalities would not have been interested at this time in the life of a man who had met a horrible death, and whose teaching was not understood, and except for the Galilean merchants who had become followers of Jesus. The Jews in Jerusalem and other prosperous and cultured centres were satisfied with their own religion, and were not ready to welcome anything which tended to disturb long established traditions. Dr. F.C. Burkitt of Cambridge says, "But our Lord and his first disciples spoke Aramaic. There is nothing to suggest that they were acquainted with the current Greek version. In the synagogues they would hear the scriptures read in the original Hebrew, followed by a more or less stereotyped rendering into the Aramaic of Palestine, the language of the country, itself a cousin of Hebrew. A faithfully reported saying therefore of Jesus or of Peter ought to agree with the Hebrew against the Greek, or at least ought not to acquire its point and appropriateness from a peculiar rendering in the Greek. Apart from questions of language and purely literary criticism, the three synoptic Gospels might be translations from the Aramaic. The main ideas of the synoptic gospels, the fundamental phrases round which move the thoughts belonging to the gospel, all have their explanation and illustration from contemporary Judaism. The kingdom of God, the Christ the Messiah, the day of judgment, treasury in heaven, Abraham's bosom, or being in the midst of Abraham. Okay, all these are Jewish ideas, entirely foreign to the native thought of the Greco-Roman world. All the disciples of Jesus were Galileans except Judas, who betrayed him. They remained loyal, and even though at first they deserted their countryman and Lord, none of them had the least idea of betraying him. They were even ready to die with Jesus. They stood by him until the servants of the high priest and the temple officers seized him in the Garden of Gethsemane. Peter followed even to the courtyard of the high priest's palace. Jesus had spent 3 years preaching in Galilee, and most of his followers were Galileans. They accompanied him to the feast in Jerusalem, saw him die on the cross, and returned to Galilee mourning and lamenting his death. Many of these men and women had faith in him and were ready to champion his cause and continue his mission. As these Galilean followers were the ones who saw Jesus after his resurrection, they were the first to bear witness to the risen Christ. The Jerusalemites and the Jews of the south continued to doubt and deny that Christ had risen. Today they insist his body was stolen by the Galileans. Also, had the gospel been written by Jews in the Chaldean dialect, the contents would have been quite different. We would doubtless read about one who had blasphemed against God and defied the authorities, and who went to the cross as a malefactor. As a result, probably. Easterners, however, never write books about men whom they have condemned. These facts clearly support the view that the Gospels were written in Northern Aramaic and not in Chaldean or Southern Aramaic. Complications naturally arise when attempts are made to go back to the original Aramaic by way of a totally alien or foreign language like Greek or even the Chaldean dialect. That's why the Apostolic Church of the East, the high priest said to Victor and Alexander, the translator, no, we don't use that one. And he said, oh, why? Isn't that the original? He said, no, it's the Greek Septuagint, LXX, translated into Syriac. That's why they don't use that. Take, for example, the Greek word logos is a direct translation of the Northern Aramaic word multa, which means word or utterance, and not the Southern Aramaic word. Well, apparently there's no actual, according to the translator Victor and Alexander, there's no actual English word equivalent for that. So he had to run around and find one, and he came across manifestation. Okay, so multa, which means word or utterance, and not the, well, that's a revelation, isn't it? Manifestation. And not the Southern Aramaic word, memra, which means a sentence. What seems obscure in the Gospels becomes quite lucid when translated from the Eastern text written in Northern Aramaic. Dr. Dalman is cognizant of the influence of Northern Aramaic in Palestine. He writes, the spread of Aramaic in the originally Hebrew Palestine must already have been begun in the year 721 BC, when Samaria was peopled by Mesopotamian colonists. Through the influence of the Babylonian and later the Persian governments, it continued to spread, finally reaching southern Palestine when the leading classes were deported from there and supplanted by the alien or foreign element. The Judean exiles on their return made a last attempt to preserve their native language. Dr. Bernier of Oxford University is equally explicit on this point, and he talks about that. Gospels were written very early, probably 10 or 15 years after the resurrection of Jesus. This is probably, possibly, right? There is no reason to date them later. Aramaic writing was common. The sacred scriptures of the Old Testament were in circulation. The tradition of the Jewish elders were also in writing. The gospel writers were witnesses who had seen and heard Jesus. So there would have been the Thomas text, right, that he gave to that particular church, to this high priest of that church. And then there would have been others that followed, probably the book of Revelation and so forth. The gospel writers were witnesses who had seen and heard Jesus. They were Galileans who accepted him at the beginning, and not Jews who rejected him. So there's a difference here. Okay, and here's some information at the bottom here. The Galileans were Jews by faith and not by race. See further information in the commentary. Yeah, they were under the Jewish laws, traditions, etc., right? But they weren't Jews. They remembered what Jesus had said and done. Had the Gospels been written in 60 or 90 AD, writers could not have mastered the extensive material, especially if they were writing in Greek, without a knowledge of Aramaic and without Aramaic documents. For instance, how could a Japanese of today reproduce the Gettysburg speech of Lincoln in Japanese with no knowledge of English and without a copy of it? It is more reasonable to suppose the Gospels were written early in Aramaic and in their native setting. They were later translated into Greek, probably Koine Greek, by Jewish and Syrian Christian missionaries, just as translations are made today on the mission field. These translators knew the Koine or vernacular Greek, but they were not sufficiently familiar with Greek idioms or expressions, and they thought their own Aramaic idioms would mean the same thing in Greek. This is why the translators render literally such idioms as "He breathed on them," which means in Aramaic He gave them courage, John 20:22. Today, when a foreigner thinks in his own language and speaks in English, his idioms become just as meaningless. The Gospels contain only an outline of the teaching of Jesus and do not go into details for two reasons. First, because the issues were still fresh in the minds of the readers who were contemporaries, and second, because Jesus, when he preached, did not explain the issues but answered the questions directly. For instance, when an American addresses an audience on such issues as prohibition, repeal, NRA, National Rifle Association, oil, he takes for granted the people understand what he is talking about. A writer does the same. 15 years later, a high school boy or girl reading a book on these questions would need to have them explained. If the Gospels were written later, the writers would have had to explain in detail the issues that were alive in the time of Jesus, and if they were written originally in Greek, they could not have retained their Semitic style. The Greek translation contains some Aramaic expressions and explains their meanings, but there is not a single sentence in the Eastern text which is not in Aramaic. It is worth mentioning in the epistles one comes in direct contact with Greek culture, philosophy and manners totally foreign or alien to Semites. St. Paul denounces the immoral practices of pagan Gentiles or non-Jews, etc. in Romans 1:26. They were unknown and revolting to Semitic peoples, especially those who were not in touch with the foreign world or the Greek world. The obscurities in the Greek and other versions are due to mistranslations of Aramaic words having diverse meanings and to misunderstanding of Oriental parables and allegories. The original writers were not responsible for those obscurities because they are not found in the Aramaic, just as Shakespeare cannot be held responsible for mistranslations of his works and plays by the people of the East who are unfamiliar with Victorian English idioms or expressions and customs. These biblical obscurities are clearly understood when rendering from Aramaic by those familiar with the idioms, expressions and terms of speech in both languages. According to the Greek text translated in the King James Version, Luke 14:26 reads, "If any man come to me and hate not his father, he cannot be my disciple." The Eastern text, "He who comes to me and does not put aside his father," etc., is more in keeping with Jesus' teaching about loving and honouring one's parents. Missionaries today put aside their parents to go to the mission field, but this does not mean they hate them. The Aramaic word "sene" means to remove aside or to hate. Through confusion of meaning, the harsh word was used instead of the more appropriate word. Mark 10:30 reads, "And mothers and children and lands were with persecutions." This was due to confusion of the word hatha, maidservants, with ayim hatha, mothers, and the mistranslation of the Aramaic word rodopia, which means pursuits and not persecutions. This is in accord with the teachings of Jesus, who offered larger rewards to those who followed him. In Luke 14:5, the King James Version reads, "Which of you shall have an ass," or an ox, that's a donkey, right, or a mule, "fall into a pit?" And Eastern text reads, "Which one of you, if his son or his ox should fall into a pit?" The Greek translator confused the Aramaic word bray, his son, for hamare, his ass, was donkey or mule. The first part of this word was probably blotted out, and the translator inferred the word might mean ass or donkey or mule, as the following word was ox. Easterners, however, in their parables and talk are more likely to link the human being with the animal, or for emphasis, rather than two animals. This work is not a critical commentary discussing textual matters. The material pertaining to textual criticism is so extensive it cannot be dealt with even briefly in this volume. And that was what this author was expecting to do later on. And it goes on and ends it, and it gives a short history of the early Christian church, that Christianity began in Galilee when Jesus was preaching there. Well, actually, if you look at the Bible, it's like it says that Paul went to see Bartholomew or Barnabas or somebody else in some other land, and there was converts there, people new to the faith. So whether they were Jewish or non-Jewish or Gentiles, he labelled them Christians. Okay, the Romans had their Greek loan word Christos, etc., and they referred to the believers in Mamishisho, or Jesus the Christ, the Messiah, as slaves to the Christos. Okay, and then Paul adapted that as well, saying, "Oh yeah, we're slaves to God," which means, or we're servants to the Christ, we're slaves to the Christ. Okay, etc. He's a master, so obviously you're a slave, right? Okay, but not in that sense where you get whipped and beaten and thrown outside and have to live in a dirty hovel and all that sort of stuff. Get whipped by crackers. It doesn't mean that. Okay, so this founding, let's say, religion, for that sake, or that movement rather, began in Galilee when Jesus was preaching there. He was the founder of this faith, and not his apostles. Okay? It came from him, right? He was the cornerstone which the Jews had rejected. His early converts were Galileans who became identified with his movement. They were called Nazarenes and later became known as Mamishisho. There's difference in spelling. He's probably using the Syriac here. It was Galilean Aramaic. It's probably Mamishisho. A-I on the end. Slight difference, right? But mean the same meaning. Christians. This faith, because the disciples like Peter especially would say, "Oh no, you're not going to call us Christians because these Romans, their pagan mixed religion, call themselves Christians, or refer to them as Christians." Okay. So when they refer to others as slaves to Christos, it's possibly a different term they're using, right? Okay. Whereas the ones who are actually that close to the Christ, they'd probably erroneously call them Christians as well, because they followed this Christ. But they would, see? So Peter had a bit of a stink up about that. No, we're not having a pagan name. We're not taking that on board. We are the Mamishisho, followers of the Messiah. This faith spread in the East alongside a long Semitic line of thought from the earliest beginnings, and it has remained independent of Western theology to this day. The kingdom of Ur-Hai, today known as Urfa in the Arabic, or it was Edessa, now known as modern Turkey, was Christianized by Thaddeus, one of the 12, and Mari, one of the 70. The geographical location and affinity in language and customs made it easier for the Galilean missionaries to approach first those people who were closely akin to them, and was in accordance with instructions given by their Lord, or their Master. "Go ye first to the lost sheep of Israel," the lost 10 tribes. These people were taken captive and settled around the river Habor in Edessa, in Mesopotamia and Persia. It was long predicted the Messiah, or the Christ, would gather the scattered people of Israel. Abgarus, or Abgar the Black, the king of Edessa, wrote and invited Jesus to come to a city. Jesus promised to send one of his disciples because he was ill. He had leprosy or something like that. The so-called Greeks who wanted to see Jesus personally were probably men from Edessa. The Eastern text states that they were Gentiles and not Greeks. John 12:20. These men spoke the same language spoken by the Galileans. Eusebius stressed the remarkable and rapid spread of Christianity in Edessa from the Apostolic Age, the firm foothold which it held in that region. It's got a footnote down the bottom here. A Western Aramaic name. In Northern Aramaic, Hai, a place of life. KH are pronounced as H in Western Aramaic. So it's also like when those on the Sarnia, the TV, etc., they say, oh, we're from ancient Kemet, etc., etc., right? It's actually wrong, because they're descendants of Noah's sons, and they had the same language. To start off with, they were Semitic, okay? They wrote Semitic wise before they changed it to Demotic. So they had the same name. The same KH was silent. So they weren't Kamites or Kemites, they were Hamites, because the K is silent, so it's Ham. Kham is Ham, not Cam. If you see it in your modern Americanized English Bible versions, it's not Cam, it's Ham. So really they were Hamites or Hamites, descendants of Ham, because it says in the genealogy that these of Canaan, Put, Mithraim, and the different places, you know, they're just, the Egyptians were descendants of, you know, that's their country became Egypt, right? That's what the Mithraim were known as later on, Egyptians. That's where they originated from. Okay. It goes on about Edessa. And all the struggles they went through up against different Mohammedan caliphs. They had, like, you know, many pleasant years, and then Tamerlane and others that persecuted them, martyred them, and so forth over a period of 18 centuries apparently. Okay, here's the one we really want to get at, is Saint Matthew. Matthew was one of the 12 disciples of Jesus. He was also called Levi, or Levi. Mark 2:14, Luke 5:29. Eastern Christians have always believed that Matthew and Zacchaeus are the same person. Zacchaeus. Luke 19:2. The name Zacchaeus means victorious. He was a native of Galilee and a publican or tax collector at Capernaum, and later at Jericho. So was he actually Greek? It doesn't look like he was. If he was a native of Galilee, a Galilean, right? Is there that possibility that he was a Greek living in Galilee? If so, where's the evidence that he was? He was a publican or tax collector at Capernaum and later at Jericho. It was a policy of the Roman provincial government to transfer such officials from one place to another. This is done in the East. As a publican, Matthew could read and write, as these were indispensable qualifications for his post. His experience in this office is seen in his arrangement of the material in his gospel. So, having that opportunity, that skill, etc., given to him or required of him, he probably did write Greek, possibly. His experience in this office is seen in his arrangement of the material in his gospel. It is probable that he first prepared a list of the sayings or logia, the words of Jesus, and then a list of his important deeds. The sayings of Jesus have always been in demand for healing purposes, and the apostle probably supplied this demand while travelling with his master and afterward. After the resurrection, additional material had to be added in the form of scrolls. He thus inserted a detailed outline of the life and teachings of Jesus, correlating all his material and giving the names of localities where they had travelled, the time, the occasion, and other items of information. This gospel was primarily written for the Jews who had repudiated the messianic claims of Jesus. So they're undermining it, says, nah, you're not the one. how dare you call yourself the Son of God, all that sort of stuff. Matthew attempted to convince the Jews that Jesus is, or was the Messiah at that particular time, the Christ, and that the scriptures had been fulfilled in him, or through him. In other words, Matthew, a Galilean, defended, see, so he's a Galilean. So where do these people get this idea that he was Greek? A Galilean defended his master before the Jews, who denounced him even after his death, because his Galilean name was Matthias. Okay, what is it in Greek? The Gospel of Matthew, according to the Eastern text, is known as the preaching of Matthew. That is to say, Matthew's version of the life and teaching of our Lord, Jesus the Messiah, right? It is obvious that this title was given by the compiler, or the scribe who assembled, who put together the scrolls together, and who was himself responsible for additional material such as the birth and genealogy of Jesus. These issues were raised later. The question of the birth of a famous man always arises after he attains power and prominence. The first Christians were concerned only in what Jesus said and did not about where and how he was born. This is true of many great living religions teachers in our day. So maybe this person who compiled these texts, put them all together into one book, and they have added additional material such as the birth or genealogy of Jesus. Okay, we know them and their works, but we know nothing about their birth and background. Is that in relation to the teachers of the day? About their birth and background, which are generally written years after they have passed away. This is true of the Eastern people, where dates of birth and death are not recorded and are only known in connection with important events such as wars, special taxations, persecutions, the rise and fall of rulers and kings. Authorship in the East is understood differently than in Western lands. A book written about the preaching of Matthew, or a compilation of Matthew's writings, would be known as the Book of Matthew. This is because the copyist does not consider himself an author of the material he writes or compiles, or copies and compiles, okay, or some other author that writes. Okay, they don't consider themselves an author of that material he writes or compiles. A book written by Joshua about Moses will be known as the Book of Moses, and Joshua's name would not be included in it. Yeah, apparently the Jews admit that the books of Moses weren't actually written by Moses, because how could Moses write a book when he's dead, long dead, right? Probably put together by somebody else. Okay, but they attribute it, it's tradition, they attribute it to Moses, because they've got to put a name to every book that was written. How could they have recorded their own deaths? There you go. They had written tribal records in their possession, which the later scribe arranged in chronological order with supplementary material after their deaths. So that might have been additional. For example, some years ago, a famous Assyrian poet composed a popular song about Ishi, father of the Assyrian patriarch, who was poisoned in Persia. The song today is known as the Song of Ishi, but the poet is a cousin of Lamsa's, whose name was Ishu, Jesus. Moreover, the writings on the scroll never contain the name of the author or the copyist, especially in the case of sacred literature. So it doesn't look like it was the same Jesus, right? This was years later, poisoned in Persia. Somebody else poisoned in Persia related to this Lamsa. Differences between the Gospels are largely due to the nature of material, oral sources, difficulties in obtaining complete sets of scrolls from which to copy, and the locality for which the text was produced. The material that would have appealed to the Jews in Judea would have been repulsive to Galileans and Syrians. This is why Mark and John omitted or left out the issue of Jesus' genealogy and the accounts of the birth. So that explains why it's not in Mark and John. On the other hand, Matthew omitted or left out the story of the woman in Samaria because the Jews hated the Samaritans, and a favourable account of a discourse between Jesus as a prophet and a Samaritan woman would have been repulsive to the Jews. John, however, seized the opportunity to convince the Samaritans and Gentiles that Jesus was not only seeking the Jewish people but the Gentiles, the non-Jews, right? Salvation was for all. He came to save all. This practice of omitting or leaving out and adding material in sacred books is still continued in the East, as illustrated by Nestorian manuscripts, some of which were written in the 5th century AD and recently published by Roman Catholics, Anglicans and Presbyterians. The books based upon these manuscripts vary according to the beliefs of those who use them. Roman Catholics omit or leave out what is against their teaching and insert what was formerly rejected by the author as heresy. So whatever they don't agree with, they'll take out and say, oh, that's heretical. Okay. Anglicans omit the names or leave out the names of some Eastern fathers who denounce the formulae, Mary, Mother of God, and God died on the cross, stating that Mary was only the mother of Jesus and Jesus died as a man. So you can't say that Jesus was God and he talked to himself, all that sort of stuff. Okay. The Easterners didn't have that. Okay. And then Roman Catholics had Mary, Mother of God, and God died on the cross, stating that Mary was only the mother of Jesus and that Jesus died as a man. Okay, that's what the Easterners are saying. Presbyterians, on the other hand, print accurately from the manuscripts. The original authors, long dead, are surely not responsible for later changes made in their writings. There is no doubt that one of the apostles wrote the material which was the basis of all the Gospels, and that Matthew was the writer. Writing was common at that time, Acts 15:23. Epistles were exchanged between Christians of Antioch and the apostles of Jerusalem, and between Paul and the churches in Asia Minor. Eusebius quotes Papias to the effect that Matthew wrote his gospel in Hebrew, that is Aramaic. Like you have Aramaic, Hebrew, Aramaic, sister languages, no consonants, basically the same words, same meanings, until maybe the Masoretes decided to add the Nakud, adding vowels, which changed not only the structure of the language but also the words. So then you would have different words. Okay, like you would have Euma for immeasurable period, unfathomable period, era, eon, or day with capital D, referring to God's, the time when the time when God created. Okay, that was his day. Whereas in the Hebrew, you'd have the smaller D, right, referring to a day of the week. So they say Euma for the Aramaic unfathomable, immeasurable period, and you'd have the Greek with the small d for a day of the week. 6 days of the, it took God 6 days, and he rested on the 7th, right? 6 literal days. So there's a difference there because of that. Eusebius quotes Papias to the effect that Matthew wrote his gospel in Hebrew, that is Aramaic. He further states that Matthew and John were the only apostles who left recorded comments. Tradition all over the East verifies this. Matthew's gospel was placed first when the scrolls were compiled because it was the first written document. The early Christians ought to have known which was the first document and who was its author. Had they known that dispute would have arisen over the authorship of these Gospels, they would have handed down to us written evidence of dates and other facts. It must be remembered that hundreds of books were burned by pagans during the 10 persecutions, where much Christian literature was destroyed, and yet the information these writings contained was handed down orally or verbally. The so-called Q document is a pure hypothesis. The variations in the Gospels were large due to the fact that some of the scribes had no access to the new material owing to their isolation. For instance, how could an Anglican missionary in Uganda, without any contact with England, know about the changes in the prayer book? Think about that one. Okay. And here's Gospel Light, commentaries with stories, sons of Thamar, Mary the mother of Jesus. Matthew traces the genealogy of Jesus from Abraham to Joseph. In doing this, he has used the Aramaic word Oled, which means begat or caused to be born, as God manifested in the flesh, right? As born as a child, as a human child, right? When he deals with Joseph and his genealogy, he changes Oled, which is masculine gender, into Eteled, feminine gender. Jacob begat Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus. The reference to Mary is to show that Jesus was born of her and not of the other wives of Joseph. Supposedly he had other wives? Oh, didn't know that one. Maybe that's why he had... not too sure about that one. He was an older man, supposedly. This is what it's saying here according to Lamsa. Maybe polygamy was quite rampant in those days. Whenever a reference is made to a particular son, the names of the mother is mentioned throughout the scriptures. Whenever a king's name is mentioned, his mother's name is also mentioned to distinguish her from the other wives of the king. If Joseph had no other wives except Mary, the word Oled would have been used in the case of Joseph as in the other instances. The 16th verse would then read, Joseph begat Jesus. But as Mary's name is mentioned, the word Eteled is substituted for the word Oled to indicate that Mary was the mother of Jesus. Even today in many Eastern countries where polygamy is still practiced, whenever a son is mentioned, reference is made to his mother as the one whom gave birth to him. Mary's espousal to Joseph. The Aramaic word for espoused is makhirta, derived from the Aramaic makhar or mahar, to purchase, to acquire for a priest, and so forth. Oh, and their custom was to marry them quite young, according to this book. Maybe not to consummate it yet. Okay, a bit like Islam with Muhammad, apparently. Yeah. That's what it has in this particular book by Lamsa. He's making that claim. A righteous man, a virgin. What is a virgin? This verse is taken. This is Isaiah 7:14. This verse is taken from Isaiah 7:14. The Hebrew text uses the word Alma, which means a young girl. The Aramaic word for a young girl is Alemta. In Aramaic, Alma is a noun which means the world or the people. The Eastern version reads Petolta, which means virgin. This word was doubtless changed when the Assyrians adopted Christianity. The Old Testament in Aramaic was written centuries before the Christian era. Petolta also means an unmarried woman who may be young or old. In this instance, the Hebrew word Alma is more accurate. The prophet meant that the Messiah would be conceived and born of a woman who is a virgin, not a nun or of some monastery. It would be improper for a king to marry a widow, because in such cases their sons could not ascend the throne, because they were the son of a commoner, right? Who was previously married. When these words were spoken by the prophet Isaiah, Palestine was invaded by the Assyrians, and the 10 tribes were carried into captivity. The kingdom of Judah was also threatened by this invasion, and the countries around Jerusalem were devastated. Women were defiled by the invading forces. The prophet depicts a new picture with a brighter future for the restoration of Judah. The Assyrian and Babylonian empires would disappear, and Israel would be restored to her former glory. Peace and prosperity would reign. There would be virgin girls in Israel. The nation would be again sanctified to God. A virgin would be the mother of the promised Messiah, through whom a new kingdom without limits would be established. Okay, it goes on about the Magi following the star. Something about Nazareth and the Nazarenes, how they pledged their children to God before they were even born. Okay, and so forth. These old customs of removing the shoes and so forth. covering a lot of subjects in the book of Matthew. And then the Beatitudes covers a few of those. And it also covers Mark, Luke and John further on. Not every verse, but just the most important ones. Giving a deep explanation of what those verses actually mean when compared with the modern Americanized English translations. Jonah and the whale. Unclean spirit. Parable of seed. Kingdom of heaven. Speaking in parables. False vision. Racial antipathy. And where Jesus asked Peter, "Who do you say I am?" Peter. Sheol, hell, exactly what that is. And so forth. We might just jump a little bit here. Okay, this is St. Mark. It goes on about Sodom and Gomorrah, Herod Antipas, and his history. Fasting and prayer. Jump a bit forward again. St. Luke, and it should cover the book of John. Yeah, St. John, door of the sheep, his own sheep, spiritual blindness, the good shepherd sitting at the feet, Jesus wept, and why? Syrians, suffering Messiah, and the Comforter, which is not Muhammad, it's the Holy Spirit. Okay, these Imams that said, oh, that's Muhammad, it's in the original Aramaic, Galilean Aramaic or Aramaic, we're totally lying. And the truth. The Aramaic word for truth is sharara, derived from shara, which means to sustain and affirm. It, in conversation, Easterners often exaggerate so as to pay compliments to one another. At times what they say is in the form of a joke. During heated debates they try to contradict or convince each other. The word truth is thus frequently used in order for carry conviction. I tell you the truth means what I am telling you is the truth and not a joke or an exaggeration, but something that I can sustain. When such a remark is made, there is no further argument. Holy Spirit rebuking the world, a male child, and so forth. So if you liked this in-depth look into George Lamsa's book, and it helps you to understand the scriptures better from an Easterner's point of view, what they are really saying and what they really mean, then subscribe to our channel, give us a like, add your comments down below the video here, and you go share it with everybody you know, so they have a better understanding of what the scriptures in the original language actually say and mean, in comparison to your modern Americanized English Bible versions, which can often mislead you because it's translated from the Greek, etc., etc., as this book has stated. So there'll be no more confusion, no more being baffled. Okay, so you see Hebrew within this book means Aramaic, the language of the Hebrew people. Hebrew is the name of the race and not the language. This is what we stressed earlier, right? When we realized in Genesis 10:6 or something like that, or maybe 11, that they were a race of people. They weren't a language. They were people who crossed over. They were the R word. So that verifies that what we're saying was actually correct. The people of Palestine called them Hebrews, which means those who crossed over the river, the Euphrates, right? Hebrew ceased to be their spoken language from 450 BC to the 9th centuries AD. Aramaic was the literary and colloquial language of the Jewish people. Hebrew remained a classical language and was only read by rabbis and during services in the synagogue, when it was interpreted into Aramaic. Okay, so the Hebrew was for all things holy, all God related inside the temple, the Aramaic for everything else outside, right? Your common news, gossip, whatever. Okay. Josephus considered Aramaic so thoroughly identical with Hebrew that he quotes Aramaic words as Hebrew, Antiquities 3:10, section 6, and describes the language in which Titus' proposals to the Jerusalemites were made, which certainly were in Aramaic, as Hebrew, BJ 6 2, section 1. It was in Aramaic that Josephus had written his book on the Jewish war, as he himself informs us in the introduction, before he wrote it in Greek, and so forth. The Sabbath, right? The preparation day. The Sabbath was approaching. The Passover was eaten on Thursday, and the preparation day was the day before the Passover and not after it. Okay, this is what people got to understand. Easterners count the day from sunrise to sunset. Okay, that's how they count the day. We have come across Christians that say no, in Genesis, etc., where it actually says a day was consisted of an evening to a morning. Okay? They say no. And the Bible says evening to evening. Well, that's in your modern versions, perhaps. But the Easterners count on it as, or refer to it as, the day prior as preparation day, and they count the day from sunrise to sunset. Doubtful Thomas, or Thomas the Doubter, the twin. Peter's loyalty tested. Peter's commission, and so forth. Raising of Lazarus, the Jews. Greater work shall he do. buried with garments. Okay, so let's see what he was actually buried with, see if it mentions it there. Okay, his friends gave him garments as tokens of appreciation. So Jesus had a number of good outer garments. Noblemen and holy men wore many garments than the ordinary person, many robes and many shirts at a time. When Jesus was crucified, his garments were divided among the soldiers. Undergarments, which consisted of a light cloak and several shirts, were not taken. In the case of a man crucified publicly, it is improper to strip him of all of his garments. A portion of Jesus' garments were left on him when he was crucified. There were many women and children standing near the cross. The chief priests and elders who were present would have resented the crucifixion of a person without garments. So he wasn't fully naked. Right? The burial of Jesus was rather hasty because of fear and lack of time. The Sabbath was approaching and the dead must be buried before the end of the day. Jesus' body was lowered from the cross and wrapped in a white burial garment. His undergarments were not removed, and his body was neither washed nor embalmed. Thus, when Jesus arose from the tomb, the burial garment having been laid aside, he appeared to the disciples as they had last seen him. So let's think about this here. Yeah, he has his undergarments on. He dies, right? Okay, he's all sweaty, whatever. He gets laid into the tomb, and he's in this other cloth. So if that shroud of Turin was that original cloth that he was wrapped in, and his body was imprinted on that cloth as claimed, then wouldn't there be the shape of his undergarments? You'd have to look at that photo and see, okay, it's not showing the undergarments. According to this Lamsa book, he had undergarments on because that's, Romans had enough respect. Children were there, etc. So yeah, they didn't want them, getting all upset, etc., or whatever, when they see this, a completely naked man on a cross, right, bleeding to death, fully naked, see all his bits and pieces. So they had enough respect to do that, to leave their undergarments on. So looking at the shroud of Turin, does it have an imprint of his undergarments, or does it show him completely naked? Again, so if you like this book that we've looked deeply into, then give us a like, subscribe to our channel, add your comments down below there, and go share this video with all your family, friends and others.